Welcome everyone. We're so excited to have this panel. I can tell you we've had a few preview conversations getting ready for this, and if that's any hint at what we're going to hear this afternoon, you're in for a real treat. So to start out, I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves and talk about, just to set the stage, why this conversation is so important to have right now.
Okay, cool. So I'm Stephanie Johnson. I'm a professor of management at the University of Colorado in the Leeds School of Business, and so I'll give a very business answer. Why is gender diversity so important to talk about? Because it impacts bottom line outcomes for organizations and drives value and stock prices. And I mean, I think that should be enough of an argument, right? The bottom line.
And I'm Patty Money. I'm the Chief People Officer for Twilio. I believe this conversation is important. I've been in the business world for way too long, and I've seen the problem for many years, and I really thought that in my lifetime it would be solved. For some reason, I was hopeful. And I don't see the movement that I would like to see. So I think engaging in the conversation is how we get movement and how we all start making this a universal problem, not just a women's problem. So I think it's just important for all of us to be talking.
Thanks. I'm Kristen Blessman, and I'm President and CEO of the Colorado Women's Chamber of Commerce. And I think the topic is important. It's interesting. When I took over the Women's Chamber, I didn't realize a lot of the statistics that were affecting women in business. And I had come from primarily male-dominated industries prior to coming to the Women's Chamber. So I worked in retail and commercial real estate, which are dominated by men. And as I began to learn about the statistics, as I was turning the Women's Chamber around and learning how to better serve the community, I think I wish that I had known back then what I know now, how to navigate this and how to navigate the system. And they say that you need to start as early on in your career as possible in order to accomplish the growth that you want to accomplish. And so now I've become kind of beating the drum with these statistics and wanting to see them change, much like Patty, because I've experienced them. And I don't have daughters, I have a son, but I would like the world to be very different for my nieces when they grow up.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Carpenter. I'm head of employee experience for Charter Communications in Denver. I'm really excited to be here with all these lovely and amazing people. So I agree, this is a moment right now, having started in my career back in the late 90s, my mom was one of the moms who went back to work and wore the bows, and she did the girl version of the guy dressing. And I remember it was very important to her to try to figure out how to fit in with looking the part. And it's been since then. And one of the very first things I did when I joined as a career, I joined a women's organization called Women in Cable Telecom. And that's been so foundational to everything I've done. And now I have two 20-something daughters who, they can't believe how long this has taken. They're just fed up. And so it's Time's Up, it's Me Too, it's this incredible and amazing movement by these young and energetic and very focused and dedicated people. And I think this is a confluence and a moment where it's infectious, and I think we're getting it a lot from those younger people who are just, why is it taking so long? So let's go.
I'm excited. I'm really excited. I'm Yolanda Chase, and I am the Director of Global Inclusion and Diversity at Arrow Electronics. I lead through thought leadership and other methods that whatever I needed to deploy at the time, thought leadership in the area of inclusion and diversity. And I think for me, very transparently, there's a lot of intersectionality when it comes to gender. And in my space, when I'm thinking about not just, the perils of the woman in the experience of growth in an organization and parity and equity, but also how this world is changing so much in terms of gender identification and gender application when it comes to how we show up at work every day. I have a daughter, 24 years old, and we have these conversations all the time, and the challenge of how are we doing things and what kinds of things are we doing that are progressive and groundbreaking. And I honestly feel like what's missing in that push to get us kind of over the edge when it comes to this equity barrier is our ability to really be do groundbreaking things. And what does that actually look like for us and the generation to come? So every day on my job, I'm thinking about groundbreaking. Let's do something groundbreaking. Let's figure this out, right? So
Yeah.
Right, no pressure at all.
Well, I am thrilled to be on the stage with all of you, and I can't wait to learn more wisdom from what you have to say today. But we're going to flip this script a little bit. I know you've been sitting down, probably listening to people all day, so we're going to give you a chance to do the opposite. We want to hear what you want to get out of this panel. So maybe just 2 or 3 things if people want to shout out the topics that they would like to, if you could walk away from this panel with something in your toolbox, what you'd like to hear today. So
how can men, such as myself, how can we be allies and help to create groundbreaking opportunities in this space?
it's a great question. Who wants to dig in?
I will take that one proudly. I think that there are many elements of this whole equality conversation, right? There are many layers to it. But I think that the foundational layer, matter of fact, I know in my spirit that the foundational layer of this is about empathy, right? It's about how are we thinking and feeling about women and their roles in society, period. So where men come into that is on the empathy side, right? I think men can always contribute to the conversation around how can we make things a little bit more equitable for women, but also ensuring in your powerful position that you're in that it actually occurs within your environment. So the empathy side is the human aspect, right? But then there's the actual doing, the call for, let me understand the position first, and then let me think and kind of take that thought leadership one step further around how do I now take what I know and can empathize in terms of what women need in the environment and apply that to my strategies and be a part of that conversation, be very fearless, but also be willing to have, I call them truth tellers next to you, who are always going to tell you the truth about what's happening with you and your blind spots and things of that nature. So it's kind of a compilation of those things as well.
I'd like to address it as well. I think, we talk about the Me Too movement, and I think it's absolutely necessary. I think it raised awareness of certain things, but one of the things that I've noticed is that it's now causing men to be fearful in the workplace. And what I would say to that as a man is dive into that fear and really address it, because what's happening is that it's really preventing relationships between men and women to be developed in the workplace. So I have had men tell me, well, I'm not going to meet with you, I'll put you over to her. And oftentimes with my business, it's important that the CEO is bought into what we do. And there's still so many men at the top, and if I can't build that relationship, it's really going to hurt the ability for women to succeed in the workplace. And in addition to that, I would say, be willing to hear, if something's difficult to hear, and if I don't have a relationship with a man, I'm not going to be able to tell him if something that he's saying to me is offensive, right? So I have a situation where my boss, who was the CEO, said something that was pretty offensive to me. He commented on, I had a wool skirt on, and he made some sort of comment about looking like a prostitute or something, which I had tights on or whatever. And because I had a relationship with him, rather than having to go to HR and say, oh, you wouldn't believe what he said, I addressed it right then, and I said, you know what, you can't say that. It's really not okay. And it kind of caused him to pause and say, oh my gosh, you're right, I'm so sorry, right? And you nip it right there to say, all right, we're not gonna talk to each other like that. And I think if we can't have relationships with each other where we trust each other and have an open mind on both sides, I don't think change is gonna happen. And so what I would say is really dive into that fear if you're fearful about, maybe I have bias, or I'm just gonna avoid it altogether and not be alone with a woman in a room or things like that. Don't buy into that. Dive in.
I do think that words matter, and one of the things, just individually, if you manage other people, if you're a man and you manage others, think about the words you use to offer praise or the words you use to offer feedback. I've noticed that we did sort of an awards and recognition of folks, and I recognized that there was a male leader who was praising people for different aspects of performance. To a person, all the women, he talked about their positive attitude and how they're so great at bringing their sunshine and their joy to the office, and it makes such a difference on the team, and that's all lovely. But to a person, all the guys are like, that guy drives results, and he's produced, and he's done this. Think about how you're praising. It also goes back to the conversation we were having earlier about then how do you promote somebody? Do you promote somebody for sunshiny smiles? Probably not, and it's probably not in our job descriptions either, but that's what we're calling out. So kind of on a micro level, everyone has the opportunity to think more equitably about what words we choose.
And I'll just add and echo those comments that now that the men in the room know these things, they can help make this message translate further to their own organizations by being a bystander. And so when you hear a man saying, you should really hire Stephanie, she's just a ray of sunshine, you can say, she is a ray of sunshine, true, and you need to focus on her competence. Or not all women have the power to say, don't call me a prostitute. But all men have the power to say to each other, don't call that woman a prostitute. And I think that's what we call like social proof. Like when a man says it, it's saying, I'm a role model and I know what's acceptable. It's not like she's sensitive. It's like, this is not what we want for our men.
I'll just add one more thing too, and that is pay attention to your own behaviors in like meetings and things like that. Little things do matter. We fall into habits. We have our go-to people that we give assignments to, and we say, hey, you know, versus making certain that you're giving women an opportunity to step into some of those stretch things, even if they weren't the people that raised their hand to ask, invite women to participate at that level. I just find we fall into traps that are really, really easy. And so just watch your own behaviors and think about, who do I go to for advice, information, for special projects, for things like that, and start rotating that around, and you'll find that you'll just have a much more inclusive team environment where women will feel much more valued.
Great. Well, hopefully you'll walked away with some to-dos or take-homes from that. What else? What else would you like to hear about today?
Hi, my name is Lindsay March. I work for Pepsi. So I'm curious about your views on unconscious bias training. I feel like it's very popular, but I've seen some studies that say it's got mixed results in the workplace. So I'm just curious for your insights about that kind of approach.
So do you want to start?
No, you
so
go.
I do a lot of unconscious bias training, and one of the things I say is that it doesn't really work, right? There was the big Harvard Business Review article that questioned unconscious bias training, and there was also a big meta-analysis, you know, all the effects of it. And so it doesn't always work, but frankly, nothing always works if you do it poorly. And so if you do it well, I think it can start a conversation that then requires systemic change and other things. It's not like nothing against Starbucks, whom I love, but you're going to teach all of Starbucks employees in half a day not to be biased. Like, you know, probably not. If you add other things, if that's the conversation starter to say that, yes, you have unconscious bias, it's totally natural, I have it too, and it's not okay to let that affect your behavior. It's human to have it, but we're going to do better. Then unconscious bias training actually is a lot more effective.
Yeah, and I'll just say, we did it at my organization, and we were acquired by another company who said, we don't do it, we don't think it works. And we talked with our workforce, like the people that had actually gone through it, and they were like, you know, it wasn't like, didn't change my life, but it made me think. And if we can stop and think about our own behaviors, if by doing that training will cause a person to think, ooh, should I actually say that? Is that stereotyping someone? Is that showing a bias in some way that I don't want to show up that way? I think it's worth every penny.
I would just add to that, one of the things that we've heard from our members, and there's been studies on this, is that there seems to be a level of knowledge of the staff that they believe that senior leadership knows that diversity is an issue, but that the top level executives don't necessarily, and namely the CEO isn't certainly bought into it, right? They recognize it's an issue, but they're not doing everything it takes to change it. So if you're doing unconscious bias training because you're going to do one and you're going to check the box, well, that's not going to work. It's got to be a commitment from the very top that things are going to change. And it goes back to what you were saying of having the tough conversations. We have a CEO here locally that was willing to sit in a room full of women and listen to what was going on in his own company, right? And that takes an incredible level of trust. So I think it's more than just training per se, right? I think that that's just one piece of the pie, and you have to do it all and be committed, and we're all still learning. We were talking about what did we call it, the golden nugget, or like this one idea. Oh, we're gonna solve it. Unconscious bias training, that's gonna work. It's not just that, right? So I don't think it's fair to say that one, well, it doesn't really work. Well, it's because I don't think that there's enough commitment at the top to trying everything possible.
And I think with any sort of training like that, you go in with the assumption that you're ashamed because you have bias. Well, we all have it. And so it's the same thing with diversity training or sexual harassment training. It's like, ooh, I did something bad. So you go in with sort of this negative sort of aura around it. Rather, Stephanie, you made the point earlier that if we can show the impact of what it means to be aware of the bias and address how that might be holding us back, whether it's in terms of revenue or diversity or whatever we're trying to measure and improve, then I think we can approach it with, okay, I know myself, I'm aware of my bias, and now here's some tools to do something about it.
Yeah. And I actually believe that cultural competence is equally as important. So as we're having conversations around unconscious bias that we all know we have, right? Even when it's like you drive by someone and you see them doing it, oh, I knew it, that's what they do. That person, and you catch yourself and say, there's my implicit bias, right, coming out. I think that cultural competence is equally as important. It has to be coupled. I think people need to understand how to work and interact and engage across difference. And, in the next 20 years, the ethnic minority is not going to be ethnic minority anymore. 20 years. And so how are we going to act and be and engage alongside our unconscious bias, implicit bias? So I feel like that organizations tend to lean one way or the other. There have been pros and cons to each. Specifically for our strategy, we looked at cultural competence being a global organization and saying this is most important, but then we take it a step further so as to not to be checked the box by going into our manager competencies and saying next step is inclusive leader training. How do you apply those skills? And really making sure that you're holding leaders accountable for being able to check themselves, and you checking them as well on unconscious bias, but also their ability to be able to work across difference. It's really important, and that is what the leader of the future needs to look like, and that is a competency that they need to apply.
And I just want to add one thing, and I know it's really, really difficult to do, and maybe others on the stage here have ideas for it, but you mentioned shame and shaming with bias, and I think that that's a critical part of the conversation, and it's something that we talk about at the Women's Chamber all the time. We're never going to change unconscious bias if we keep shaming people for having it, right? And so how do we create a cultural environment where it's okay to admit our biases or be called out on them and not feel like a jerk for having them? And I don't know if anybody else on the stage has advice for that, but it's something that I try and work on every day. If I'm feeling something, I say it out loud. Oh gosh, I just did this. It's so bad of me, but I want to say it because I think it's really important. And I don't want to be shamed for it.
And think about the society that we live in right now in terms of unconscious bias. I was listening to a radio show, XM Radio, where they can talk about anything, and the gentleman on the show was doing a game that was called White, Black, or Other. And it was people can call in and they would talk about like crimes that people would do, and then you would win a prize if you could guess if it was a white person, black person, or other. And the first time I heard it, I thought, I know this is meant to be funny, and it's meant to make us feel more comfortable about talking about our unconscious bias, but come on. I mean, really. And I think when you think about the societal impact, and just how we either perpetuate it or we don't, whatever. But it is that shaming part as well. Do we associate unconscious bias constantly with something that's negative or criminal or crime or of a specific race or whatever? And I think that it's the human aspect of changing that narrative a little bit as you apply unconscious bias kind of awareness to get rid of that shame, right, element.
Yeah, I'll just say one more thing. People need tools to actually address bias too. And I think that's one of the things that unconscious bias training does. It gives you some tools that when bias shows up, you can know what to say. You've got some words. Just as a takeaway for you, check out the NC WIT website. They have a bias busting toolkit that just gives people words and ways to address when they see bias occurring, that they can just say, hey, tell me more about that, or why would you say that, or just little things that give you permission and a good way to have the conversation without it becoming shaming, without it becoming like you're a bad person and I'm the good person that recognized this. How do you actually engage? So I think unconscious bias training can give people tools to actually address it that are helpful and keep the shaming.
Yeah, at a minimum.
Yes.
I have a lot of follow-up questions from that, but we're going to take one more from you all. Sure.
So how do you address the issue of perceived reverse gender discrimination or equality? Because I've seen that even in our workforce. If we try to spotlight anything when it comes to gender equity, then you have the men and women almost pitted against each other. But in the same breath, the one unprotected class would be white males under 40 who don't have disability status or veteran, any of the Title VII. And they sometimes feel like they're the ones then that are left out when the focus is around minorities or gender-specific ideals. And pitting that to the next point of, are there metrics that you should promote versus not promote in order to make sure that you are including everybody in it and not just creating even more of a competition between men and women or the majority versus minorities?
I'm happy to start with, because I feel like this is the most common theme that I ever hear when talking about diversity in organizations. If I go in and do a study and interview people, I think it's a really common fear, and I'll say just a couple things. One, I think we need to have empathy for that. Like, the world is changing. We hear all the time what you need to be a leader in the future are female skills, feminine skills, and we're going to stamp out toxic masculinity, right? I feel like that's, to your shame point, it's like kind of threatening. So I think I try every day to have empathy for that. But also I think the other antidote to that is transparency. So if people say, well, I think women are getting promoted because of their gender, or people of color are getting opportunities that I'm not getting, so I really doubt that. Like, if you looked at the statistics, like one guy I interviewed said, I've been passed over for all these executive roles. I think 50% of our executive team are women. What are they going for? 100%. And I'm like, it's 20. It's 20% is the number. But because they're not more transparent with their data and they're trying to make themselves look good, we're doing all these things to promote women, it actually is having that backfire effect. So I think if you share that information, how processes are done, how people are promoted, what are your statistics, then I think it's hard to argue with the data.
And I'd agree with that. I think one of the things we have to be careful of is that we have the conversation as an or, either or, and it's an and. It's if it's like we're in it together, it's not, it's only women and we're only do this, it's and. So how do we change the dynamics of the conversation? I literally, at one point in time, I stood in front of our company and talked about a referral program that we were starting. And I said, we've got to be really careful about this because we're a predominantly white male environment. And so our networks are predominantly white male. So we could actually hurt our diversity efforts, through a referral program. So let's be careful about that. And the emails that I got, they were bad. I had people that came to my office and were like, what do you like about white men, and what's wrong with being a white man, and blah, blah, blah. So I had a lot of that. And really, there's nothing wrong with being a white man. And I think we have to be embracing of all people in our organizations. There's nothing wrong with being a white man, but we don't want to work with all white men. We don't want to work with all women. We don't want to work with all anything. It's the and the togetherness that is going to make us stronger businesses and a great place to work. So I think just trying to change the dynamics of it having to be a choice helps a lot.
And I also think that we don't want to minimize the fact that, that inequality exists. I think that when we start talking about, equality within the organization and doing things that are equal and equal playing field and all of those things, we still need to remember that the systems were set up a certain way long time ago. And what we're trying to do right now is, navigate away from that, create more even playing field where everyone has the opportunity to succeed, and to also identify in our organization if that even playing field does not exist. And if it doesn't, then the white male under 40 who feels like he's been passed over, I point back to that statistic. And I say, we must have an even playing field, and we have to create that in our systems, in the life cycle of every employee. But we don't minimize difference.
And I think the even playing field is when we talk about equity, that's what we mean. We aren't necessarily going for equality, because that would sort of whitewash all the diversity and the inclusion, right? We need that rich mix of all those perspectives and types of people. And the goal would be to treat all equitably and offer equal opportunities for those. And I think that, again, it kind of plays back to that notion of fear and anxiety, and in fear, sort of the opposite of love and abundance. And so if you put somebody on their back foot, worried and fearful that something's going to be taken away, I think the idea as leaders and as people who have open minds is to spread that word of abundance and love, that we all can get to a place of equity together. It's not either or.
We, at the Women's Chamber, we do this award ceremony. It's called Champions of Change, and the idea behind it was to bring forward innovative practices in the advancement and promotion of women. And one of the winners, Pinnacle Assurance, last year, I don't know how they do this with so many employees, but they don't look at benefits necessarily male, female, right? They try and meet that person where they are, and they had several stories of employees that were just experiencing hardships. And they met them where they were, and they provided benefits that they needed at that time, male or female. And I never really thought about it that way. Often we think, oh, well, women want more time off to be with their kids, or they want maternity leave, and they didn't look at it that way at all. They created their benefits packages around what individuals needed in their time of stress.
Personas.
Yeah, and I think it was just such an eye-opener for me that I had never thought about before. And it's game-changing when you think of systems changing, and I know it must be really difficult for a large company to do, but it really spoke to me. When we begin to do that and listen to individual stories and create benefits around that, that's a game changer.
So I work with words all the time, and they matter a lot to me, and I want to pay attention to the title of this panel, which is How To. So let's talk about how to, big and small ways. There's so much experience on this stage, executive experience, research experience, just knowledge about this industry. What are big and small ways that the people in the audience can take back to their companies, to take back to whatever business that they're doing right now to make change happen?
So I was just telling you all on the panel about the millennials and Gen Z. And I think paying attention to that and perhaps tapping into their impatience and their creativity, hosting hackathons, for example, on what small benefit, what small change, what small conversation can we start by tapping into some of that passion and excitement and creativity around how do we do this? So small things, that also can flow up to reverse mentoring. We have so much to learn from this new generation that is, I think it's going to be 30% of the workforce by 2026, if I'm misquoting that fact, but it's soon. So let's pay attention to that and really tap into that as a resource.
Yeah, the other thing I'd say is when we talk about equity, it happens throughout the entire, pay equity is what we talk a lot about, but it's an outcome. It's actually what happens at every stage of organizational work that creates that outcome of pay inequity. So, as professionals working in our businesses, how do we pay attention to how we hire, I mean, that's critically important. How do people negotiate salaries? Because women negotiate very differently. All of us women, we need to take a negotiating class and, you know, do that work. But we do. We negotiate differently. How do we handle promotions? How do we give job assignments? How do we make certain that there is equality and that people have an opportunity to step into opportunities within our organization? Are you paying attention to your promotion rates? Are you looking at how many women are moving directly into management roles? Because they're going to be your pipeline going forward. So I think a lot of times I think most good companies are doing their pay equity analysis. We're like, okay. And then they turn around 2 years later and they say, look, we have a pay equity issue again. How is that happening? Well, it's because of all of these steps in our employment processes that lead to that outcome. So I think really digging into each and every one of those is our job. And if we do that, we'll find those places where inequality occurs, and then we can stop it at that stage so that it doesn't progress and we see more women in more senior level positions.
And I really think that Patty makes an excellent point in every critical point in the life cycle. And I think that even as you enter an organization, your company should be set up, and I challenge any of those brainiacs that write code and can make applications and technology that can do this, but I think that we need to equip our recruiters in the front end as well with the ability to be able to challenge, and you have to have the culture that supports it, but to be able to challenge managers when they're hiring someone into the organization and it's creating an equity glitch. And right now it's like being able to give them the tools and the resources that they immediately can say, here's the job offer. How do I push back on the fact that I've got this tool here that's showing me that if it comes in at this level, it's now going to create inequity in the organization. I think that that's groundbreaking stuff and things that it's that kind of a mindset that I think that we need to have in each one of those steps throughout the organization and throughout the life cycle, including when we're doing succession planning and when we're doing the employee performance appraisal, when we're also doing special project consideration, that there's a check at each one of those points where you're matching, looking for that equality and being mindful. But it also means that you have to change the culture of your organization. And you have to be, those of us who are way makers, right? We have to be confident in having the conversations with leadership and basically negotiating and influencing around these things are critical to our culture. And if our philosophy and our intention is X, then we need to be doing these things and investing in these tools, resources, technologies, et cetera, that help us to get there.
So well said. I'll add one thought. I think setting goals. People feel really creeped out about setting diversity and inclusion goals, or you might set engagement goals. We want 70% of our employees to be engaged, but we don't tend to do that around diversity and inclusion, and it really works because what's measured matters, and how do you know what you're trying to get to if you've never benchmarked or set a goal in place?
Yeah, with the company I work for, we set a goal by 2023 to have 50-50 gender parity and 30% URP representation in the organization. Wow. And that is a big, hairy goal. I mean, it is hard and it's scary. And people are like, I don't know if we'll get there. And I'm like, well, we'll never get there if we don't set the goal. Yeah. If we're not willing to have that appetite for going out there. And then I would also piggyback on your measurement. We need to be putting our data out there. We need to be sharing what's working, what's not working. So many companies now actually post their diversity data. They say what their representation is, what their programs are that are working. But we also need to be saying, we tried this and it didn't work at all, so that we can share and learn from each other, and we'll all get better because of that.
I agree. We did a survey of our members last year, and it's predominantly women, and we asked them what are the 3 things that are holding women back from growth, and these were primarily women from larger corporations. And they said number 1 is unconscious bias in corporate culture. So going back to the bias training, I think that it's important. You mentioned culture and ensuring that your culture changes. Number 2 was communication, and this won't be a surprise. That was both how women advocate for themselves, so you talked about negotiation, but it's also how we talk to ourselves, right? Oh, I can't get that promotion, or maybe I'm not ready, and talking about, making sure that women are applying for the jobs because knowing that we communicate to ourselves this way, and lack of mentorship and sponsorship. So I think if you address those three things, at least that's what we've heard from our members, that's perceived barriers for them, you're addressing those barriers in your workplace.
Well, and on the culture side of it, I think we have an opportunity. Often when we say we are hiring for cultural fit, I think that we're kind of tripping ourselves up again, because if you're hiring for cultural fit, you're simply going to perpetuate the culture you already have. People get uncomfortable with somebody who has any sort of diverse way of thinking or comes from a diverse background, and I think perhaps as opposed to going to the negative of you have an unconscious bias, saying, let's bias it in the positive direction of we need more neurodiversity, gender diversity, ethnic diversity, because it will help us make better decisions. So I think hiring for cultural fit, we need to kind of take off the table.
Yeah.
So here we are in the final moments. Let's do final thoughts, takeaways, what you think people need to hear before we leave this venue.
I love to talk about gender, and I think gender is a really big issue, and people say this is 50% of our population. One thought, I guess, to take away is that white women are 30% of the population, white men are 30% of the population, and the other 40% are people of color. And I think we don't spend enough time talking about that issue as well, and then the intersectionality of women of color who are, I see the data, white women are making progress in terms of getting on corporate boards and things like that. And that's not as true for women of color or men of color.
Right. I always take the human side again, once again. Be fearless in your approach around making true impactful change. And when I was placed into this role and appointed into this role in my current organization, the first thing that I said was that I wanted to make sure that whatever strategy I built was built on stone and not sand. And if I was in a position to have a difficult conversation about what I thought was happening in the organization, then I would be a waymaker and then I would do it. That could mean my job at any moment, right? But I had to have a confidence that this work is compelling and it's so purposeful. And it changes not only the inside your organization, but it actually impacts your community and changes your community. So I offer to my colleagues and any of you out there who are D&I experts or in your organization trying to move these things forward, is that you really have to draw upon your ability to be able to be fearless and have a conversation that may be extremely uncomfortable for you and for the other leader and the person in the room. But you also have to fall on your own ability to be confident in what you're saying and what you're doing. And guess what? If it ends up that you're not with that organization anymore because you were a truth teller and a waymaker, that's okay. You go find another organization where you can be fearless and be a truth teller and a waymaker. It has to exist in our thought leaders today to be able to move this stuff forward. And I feel like that's the biggest piece that that we're kind of challenged with, is coming into work and feeling like, if I say this, it's conformity bias, and if I don't do this and I don't do that. And you can't do that in this kind of work. Take the data and also the human side of it.
I mean, I think having one small change, one small conversation, and you're going to start seeing that pick up. Whether it's, if you have a job posted right now, go back, relook at the job description. Is it written for a certain person who has great cultural fit with any sort of words that might imply others are not welcome? One conversation at a time. I've had such good fortune to work with fairly open-minded men, which I appreciate so much, where if I have a conversation with them and they use a word, the B word is one that just sends me off. And we were in a meeting and one of the men in the room used that word, and I must have looked daggers at him. But before I even had the opportunity to say something, he sent a note apologizing to everyone in the meeting for using that word. It was literally 15 minutes after the meeting. Nobody said anything. I was going to.
Yeah.
After he sent the apology, I did. I thanked him and I said, I appreciate you recognizing that. But it's one small thing at a time. We all can. We all have the power.
I would just add, especially when you're waymaking, I love that word, get a group of supporters. I have one sitting next to me. As you're doing this, you're going to need support because you're going to tell yourself, oh, should I have said that? What about, am I really doing this? I do this all the time. Stupid, I shouldn't have done that. And I think that having that group of supporters around you that tell you the truth is super important.
And I agree with everything everyone here said. But I will just encourage each and every one of us here, when we think about gender equity, just find a woman to lift up. You know, be a person that lifts a woman up in your organization. All of us, no matter what seat we sit in, have that opportunity to help somebody learn, to help somebody grow, to lift someone up. And I think if we all take that mindset with the people around us, then we will find our way to equity, hopefully before I die anyway, you know. I'm hoping that happens. It's not going to be before I retire, but
Someday.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time today and your wisdom. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
thank you.